Welcome to The Explainer. So, what if I told you that just disagreeing with someone could be a sign of your own destruction? Kind of heavy, right? Well, today we are diving into a really powerful sermon that makes exactly that claim. It lays out this spiritual framework where opposition isn't just, a difference of opinion. It's a path with some seriously dire consequences. Right out of the gate, the sermon hits you with this incredibly high-stakes claim. It's immediately framing opposition not as some simple disagreement, but as a direct sign that you are headed for ruin. This one sentence, right here, it sets the tone for everything else we're going to talk about. It makes it clear that the stakes could not be higher. Okay, so what does the sermon actually mean by opposition? And, where does it say this destructive impulse even comes from? Let's unpack the foundation of this whole teaching. Now, the definition they give here is, it's incredibly broad. We're not just talking about debating some core theological point. In this context, opposition is anything from rejecting a passage of Scripture to questioning the authority of religious leaders, who are positioned as God's chosen servants. So it covers a lot of ground. The sermon then really pinpoints pride as the root cause of all opposition. It creates this stark contrast with humility. So on one side you've got pride, which makes you stubborn, you refuse to be corrected, and on the other side you have humility, which makes you teachable and willing to submit. This split, this binary, it is absolutely central to the sermon's entire argument. All right, so to see how this all plays out in practice, the sermon brings up its first big case study. It's a really dramatic story of rebellion from the Old Testament, specifically the book of Numbers. So the drama kicks off with this guy named Korah. Now what's interesting is that he's from the same priestly tribe as Moses and Aaron, so he's an insider. But he decides to challenge their authority. And get this, he's not alone. He actually rallies a pretty significant number of followers to his cause. Now, the way the sermon portrays the consequences here is what's truly striking. I mean, they're not just severe, they're immediate and absolutely catastrophic. There's no negotiation, no second chance. The act of opposition is met with instant, divine punishment. And that creates this really powerful and, frankly, terrifying link between the two. So, the next case study the sermon uses adds another layer of complexity. Here, we're not dealing with just a simple challenge to authority. Nope. Instead, we have a conflict between two figures who are both considered to be anointed by God. So the sermon really zeroes in on King Saul's jealousy and his opposition to his own successor, David. This is a much more complicated situation, right? It's not just a regular person challenging a leader. Now we have one anointed figure turning against another. And that really begs the question, what happens when the current authority resists God's chosen future? For Saul, the punishment for his opposition wasn't some sudden, fiery end. It was something much more insidious, a complete spiritual exile. The sermon describes how God's Spirit just abandons him, leaving him tormented by this dark presence. And maybe the worst part of all, he's met with divine silence. God just goes quiet on him. So then the sermon kind of pulls back from these specific stories to make a much broader point. It argues that these aren't just one-off incidents. Nope, they're part of a consistent, predictable pattern of what happens to anyone who chooses to oppose. This is where the sermon's argument really locks in. It lays out this clear, terrifying progression. It all starts with a loss of physical well-being, like unanswered prayers for healing. From there, it escalates to spiritual isolation, that divine silence we talked about. Then, it moves to the complete departure of God's presence. And finally, for those who just refuse to back down, it ends in sudden and total destruction. And all of this, it leads to the sermon's final, really powerful conclusion. After all the stories, after all the warnings, it all boils down to a simple, stark choice for every single person listening. There is no gray area here. So here's the bottom line. According to this teaching, there's no room for a middle ground. You are either a friend of God, defined by your humility and obedience, or you are an enemy of God, marked by your pride and opposition. And in this framework, even a single act of opposition is enough to land you squarely in the enemy camp. But the sermon doesn't just end with a warning. It finishes with a call to action, urging the audience to go out and spread this message. And this transforms the teaching from just a simple warning into a mission, basically turning listeners into messengers of this very urgent and uncompromising truth. It's a really powerful and uncompromising framework that leaves us with some profound questions, doesn't it? When the cost of dissent is presented as being this high, what does that tell us about the nature of faith and authority? And how does it shape the relationship between an individual and the institution? It's definitely a lot to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.